The Six Nations, an annual international rugby tournament that showcases some of the greatest teams, players, and rivalries that the sport has to offer. Although the tournament lasts just 5 weeks, it has plenty of twists, turns, and enthralling rugby action each year. The Six Nations is my favorite rugby tournament, and as someone who watches many sports, I recently thought to myself, what if other sports follow in the footsteps of rugby? What if each year we were treated to best on best international action in each of the sports that we adore? So, here it is. What if other sports had the Six Nations? We're starting off with the big one. The world's game, the beautiful game, and my favorite sport of all, football. The one when you actually use your foot, not the other one. It will be quite challenging to do a Six Nations for a sport that's only played on one. Although I am a staunch believer that FIFA World Rankings is usually bullshit, I'm going to put my morals aside here and use them for this experiment. As the most recent update in the World Rankings, which was the 9th of December, the current top 6 nations in football are, respectively, Argentina, France, Spain, Brazil, and Portugal. In turn, between these 6 would be mouth-watering. We'd have Messi and Ronaldo going head-to-head in international colours. We'd have a rematch of the most recent Euro and World Cup finals. We'd have some of the fiercest international rivalries in the form of Brazil vs Argentina, England vs France, and Spain vs Portugal. And on top of that, we'd have some straight-up ballers going head-to-head on a weekly basis. Vinicius Jr., Lamine Yamal, Jude Bellingham, Kylian Mbappe, Florian Wirtz, Bukayo Saka, Antony, the list goes on. And as great as it would be, it isn't the only way to go about creating a football equivalent of the Six Nations. Although the Six Nations does boast some of the greatest international sides of rugby union, it isn't necessarily the sixth best. Rugby is a truly global sport, and one which is divided by 2 hemispheres. Six Nations is a collection of big names from not only the Northern Hemisphere, but specifically Europe. If we took these rules into consideration, the football Six Nations would just consist of Europe's finest, which would be, respectively, France, Spain, England, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And if FIFA rankings weren't completely cooked, perhaps we'd see the likes of Germany and Italy. This would still be an incredible tournament, with some of football's biggest names going head-to-head. And if we have a continental best for Europe, we may as well have one for the Southern Hemisphere. The Rugby Championship is an annual national rugby competition between Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Argentina. Perhaps a football equivalent of this might look like Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Colombia going at it. And though it may be fun to speculate, the last thing we need in football is another throwaway international competition. Also, it's important to understand the structural differences between international rugby and international football. Football is the biggest sport in the world, which means there's more capacity for larger tournaments and for each continent to have its own. Rugby is still incredibly popular, but it's no coincidence that the biggest rugby nations have, at one point, been influenced by the British. Rugby isn't as widespread, so in order to make an international tournament that's actually exciting, they need to pull teams from all over the hemisphere, rather than just one continent. So, I guess the moral of the story is that football is still the greatest sport of all. You're welcome for wasting your time. On to another one of my favorite sports, we're talking about basketball. Although it is a sport that's dominated by America, basketball is truly a global game, with some of the biggest names and most passionate fan bases coming from outside the United States. As of the most recent FIBA ranking, the top 6 men's sides are currently the United States, Serbia, Germany, France, Spain, and Canada. That's the likes of Nikola Jokic, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Victor Wembanyama, Anthony Edwards, Steph Curry, LeBron James, Kevin Durant, and so many more stars going head-to-head on a daily basis. And all 6 teams are from North America or Europe, so if this tournament were to take place, they could alternate hosting on each continent, with the NBA and EuroLeague both having the infrastructure to host a tournament of that capacity. Although, I'm not sure if there's much of a point to this. One way to look at it is just a more competitive version of the Olympics. There's only 12 teams in Olympic basketball, and about half of those are seen as teams that have a shot at making a decent run. So, a Six Nations basketball would just undermine the Olympics. One way I could see it happening is if the NBA takes on a similar model to the NHL. For those that aren't aware, there's been a recent trend of All-Star games losing both credibility as well as attention. This is mainly due to the fact that players don't want to get injured, so they don't really try. The NHL knows this was happening, so they came up with a 4 Nations face-off, a best-on-best tournament from the 4 nations that have the most players in the NHL. This was an overwhelming success. The games were thoroughly entertaining, the competition was fierce, and as for the question of whether or not players put effort in, there were 3 fights in the opening 9 seconds of USA and Canada's opening matchup. It may be tough to do an entire tournament with 6 nations in the span of a week, but the NBA could certainly adopt a 4 nations model. In this case, the top 4 nations will be the United States, Serbia, Germany, and France. Merely hypothetical, but with basketball only growing at a more rapid rate, it's certainly something I'd love to see. Next up are the second most watched sport in the world, Cricket. Cricket's influence is incredibly similar to rugby's, as it was spread through the world by the British. Because of this, there's some top-level cricketing nations that also excel in rugby, and some that do not. However, one similarity between the two is that because there are top teams scattered all around the world, a Six Nations style tournament can make more sense than a series of continental tournaments that we see in football. Cricket's Six Nations be composed in a number of different ways, and that's because of 3 different formats. If you use the current test rankings, the top 6 would be, respectively, Australia, South Africa, India, England, New Zealand, and Sri Lanka. Some big names I miss out in this format would be Pakistan, the West Indies, and Bangladesh. However, if this tournament were to actually exist, sides such as Pakistan and the West Indies, who are historically strong, would likely be included. If Cricket Six Nations was an ODI competition, it would include the likes of India, Australia, Pakistan, South Africa, and Sri Lanka. This would see sides such as England, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and the West Indies snubbed. And lastly, the T20 format to be used, the tournament will contain India, Australia, England, West Indies, New Zealand, and South Africa, and exclude the likes of Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. T20 would probably be the most feasible format to conduct a Cricket Six Nations, so it's interesting to think how it would play out. It should also be mentioned that there's a tournament called the ICC Champions Cup, which is a quadrennial national competition between 8 of international cricket's finest sides. With this already being in place, I feel like there wouldn't be much of a point of introducing a Six Nations tournament. However, I do like the idea of a cricketing Six Nations. I think there's enough elite teams for it to be competitive and enough of a global presence for it to not take away from other competitions such as the World Cup. However, the cricketing calendar is already congested enough, so I doubt we'll see any new international competitions anytime soon. Now, we're on to hockey. In hockey's Four Nations, which I spoke about earlier, was one of the reasons I decided to make this video in the first place. I couldn't possibly speak highly enough about the Four Nations and how I think other sports can follow suit. And although the verdict of a potential Six Nations is merely hypothetical for most of the sports I've spoken about already, hockey is one that could actually occur one day. Because of the resounding success of the inaugural Four Nations last month, there's been serious talks of not only bringing the tournament back, but adding a potential 5th and maybe even 6th nation. So I guess the question is, what would these 2 additional nations be? If you're not too well versed in the world of hockey, the big 4 nations are Canada, the United States, Sweden, and Finland. These are 4 which are traditionally the most successful nations internationally, as well as the 4 nations which boast the most current NHL players. Russia are currently the 2nd highest ranked national team, and actually has more NHL players than Finland. However, they're kind of banned from all international competition, so I doubt they'd be one of the additions. However, 2 nations that do have a decent amount of NHL players, as well boast a current higher world ranking than the United States and Sweden, are the Czech Republic and Switzerland. The Czech Republic are higher ranked and have more players than NHL, so if they had a 5th nation, they'd probably be the best shout. But if they go for the Six Nations format, Switzerland would be another strong addition. Some other nations that could be considered for a spot are Germany, Slovakia, and Latvia, who are currently all ranked amongst the top 10 men's sides of the world, as well as having a presence of players in the NHL. Last, but certainly not least, we have America's pastime, baseball. And although it is America's pastime, baseball has become a global sport in recent years. In fact, the United States are ranked a surprising 5th on the most recent WBSC World Ranking. As of now, the top 6 baseball nations are Japan, Taiwan, Venezuela, Mexico, the United States, and South Korea. This ranking also, for the most part, corresponds to the top 6 nations that have the most active MLB players. The only difference is the Dominican Republic, who have the 2nd most MLB players but rank 11th in the world, Cuba, who have the 4th most MLB players but rank 10th in the world, and Puerto Rico, who have the 5th most MLB players but rank 9th in the world. Some other notable differences are Japan, who rank 1st in the world but have just 7 players in MLB, and South Korea, who have the 6th best team in the world but just 6 players in MLB. This is due to the fact that both nations have incredibly strong domestic leagues, and although it is in no way uncommon for Japanese and Korean players to make the move to MLB, it isn't necessarily required for the strength of the national team. Because of this, it would probably make sense to use a combination of the international rankings as well as the nations that have the most players in MLB to configure who would participate in the Baseball Six Nations. So, I took the 9 nations who have a spot in both the top 11 world rankings and most MLB players, averaged their respective positions together, and took the top 6. Only issue with this was Puerto Rico and Cuba had the same average, so used the World Baseball Classic medal count as a tiebreaker. Puerto Rico have won 2 silver medals throughout their history compared to Cuba's 1, so my calculations can confirm that the Baseball Six Nations be composed of the United States, Venezuela, Mexico, Japan, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. This would see Cuba, South Korea, and Panama being stumped in the tournament, which, if you have a problem with that, take it up with math, not me. Now that we know which teams will compete in a hypothetical Baseball Six Nations, now I guess the question is, what would this look like in the baseball calendar? The World Baseball Classic isn't held annually, so there's a place for it. Also, with the World Baseball Classic not always attracting the viewership you would expect, a best-on-best tournament could be a good way of promoting international baseball. It also showcased the biggest stars of the game, with the top 5 players from both American and National League MVP voting last season coming from nations that were represented in the hypothetical tournament. I love a bit of Six Nations action, and it was interesting to think about what it would look like in other sports. Be sure to comment which sport you think would be the most feasible to introduce a Six Nations style tournament.